Paola, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, we are, I don't know, 2 weeks from this election? Exactly 2 weeks from this election.
2 weeks.
My goodness. Tell us where we sit right now in terms of the Latino vote and how it's breaking down Trump-Harris undecided. Because I just went to Google it this morning, and Fox News has a headline saying Trump is ahead with the Latino vote. And then there was a Hill headline that said the exact opposite.
Yeah. I mean, I think the story in 2 weeks will be that Kamala Harris will win the Latino vote. But I do also predict that Donald Trump will also make inroads with the Latino vote. And so I think the big question will be whether the inroads that Donald Trump made in November of 2020, because in November 2020, he did between 8 to 10 points better with Latino voters then than he did in 2016. And so I think the question in 2 weeks will be whether those inroads in 2020 were an anomaly or if they sort of represent like a bigger shift within the Latino vote. And so the way that I'm thinking about it is that like two stories can be true at the same time. No, it can be the case that Kamala Harris wins the Latino vote, and it will also be the case that Donald Trump does better.
And put some numbers behind this. Over the past few cycles, what has been the vote share of the sort of top of ticket Democrats versus Republicans, and what's like the best worst case scenario as you see it in this election?
Yes, I think what's interesting is that for Democrats for decades, Latino voters have always been on their side, right? They sort of have been at the heart of their theory of change and at the heart of the sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. So someone like Barack Obama in 2012 got at least 70% of the Latino vote, which is huge, right? Then Hillary Clinton got 60 plus. And then someone like Joe Biden was barely averaging at 60% of the Latino vote. Now, when you think about Republicans typically get no more than 30% of Latino voters. I think the one that got the best share of the Latino vote was someone like George W. Bush, but specifically because, remember, back then he was promising comprehensive immigration reform. And so his message to Latinos was very pro-immigration, was coming from a place of compassion. And so where we are right now is we're staring at the fact that someone like Donald Trump, that is promising mass deportations, that is sort of using the language that he's using, someone like him is polling anywhere between 35% to 40% with Latino voters, depending on the polls, depending on the days. And so I think that's kind of the big question mark that people have right now. How is it and what does it say that Donald Trump is polling so well with Latino voters, who, of course, many of whom believe themselves to be the descendants of immigrants?
So tell me why? Why is that?
Well, that's $1 million question. But look, even the New York Times CNN poll a couple of weeks ago had a really interesting survey where they found that the majority of Latinos, including foreign-born Latinos, are not insulted by Donald Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? They don't see themselves reflected in Donald Trump's language. So I think there's a lot of things that are happening. Number one is just the fact that Latino voters today are so different from like my parents' generation, right? Like 30 years ago, I think what it meant to be a Latino was really sort of surrounded around the idea of this like immigrant story. So much of what united us was that like origin immigrant story. I think now we're staring at a voting bloc that is more Americanized, more assimilated, it's younger, we mostly speak English. So I think there is a segment within Latinos that simply feel more in line with sort of Trump's version of America than they do with sort of their connection to that immigrant story. So I think, number one, that's happening. The second thing I think is the fact that the fear-mongering really works, right? If you spend day and night telling America that migrants are sort of these scary criminals, right? That they're taking your jobs, that they're knocking at your door and sort of fundamentally threatening American culture, I think that's a really powerful strategy. And I think it makes sense that a significant chunk of Latino voters are also sort of tapping into that fear mongering. So I think those are sort of two of the forces that are in place. And then the third one, which I think is the most complicated one because it's nuanced. I think what the studies also show is that there are a group of Latinos that do not want to be lumped into sort of the immigrant community, right? Because some theories show that many believe that immigrants sort of devalue and sort of decrease their social status, right? By being sort of adjacent to immigrants, the theory says that sort of mainstream America will view Latinos in a more negative light. So I think All this to say, it's extremely, extremely complicated, but it definitely is really telling.
Yeah, let me give you 3 data points that have kind of
Yes.
caught my radar over the past couple of years. One is going back to the 2022 election. I went down to Pennsylvania, Lehigh Valley, and
Hmm.
I was talking to um, immigrants and descendants of immigrants, Latino voters there. And what I was hearing time and again there was a frustration with Democrats for treating them as a monolith.
Hmm.
And what I heard some guy told me, and I aired it at the time, was he was like, "Look, I'm a small business owner. That's my identity. More than anything else,
Yeah.
I want to be treated like the complex person that I am." You know, I'm paraphrasing what he said,
Hmm.
and he felt like Democrats only treat him as like a single issue voter. So
Totally.
that was sort of one data point. Two is recently I did this series on Staten Island where I grew up,
Hmm.
looking at
Hmm.
the migrant crisis, and one thing I found was that there was a little bit of tension between the Mexican immigrant community and the recently arrived migrants because the
Yeah.
arrived migrants were working for less. And
Mm.
so that seemed, as I saw that, I was like, oh, that seems like an opportunity for
Oh
somebody
yeah.
like a Trump, you know, who wants to make an issue out of that. Now we can come back to whether Trump's policies would discriminate on either of those, because my read on Trump's mass deportations, it would apply to the Mexicans too.
Hmm.
Um, and then three is this polling recently came out, and I'll try to find it and link to it in the show notes, that showed that Black and brown voters, Democrats tend to trend way more moderate than white progressives
Mm.
do. Yet white progressives talk about Black and brown communities as if they're all kind of coming from this sort of shared sense of identity. Um, and that seems to be a glaring red light for a lot of Democrats in my life who probably don't reflect that in their politics.
Totally. That's so interesting. I mean, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and I recognize a lot of those patterns. So the first one, right, this idea that Democrats typically think of Latino voters as these single issue voters, I totally agree with that. I do think there's a difference now. But I remember before jumping into journalism back in the day, I was working in the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Obama campaign. And so much of sort of the outreach to Latino voters was, to your point, through the lens of immigration, right? The idea was if you're Latino, you just care about immigration. And the outreach strategy was you go to sort of these Spanish language platforms, Univision, Telemundo, and that's sort of, the way that you check your Latino voting outreach plan. I think things are changing. I think this is one of perhaps the first campaigns, presidential campaigns on both the Republican and the Democratic side, where both campaigns are doing things really differently, right? It used to be the case that they would knock on our doors maybe 3, 4 months before the election. Now you see that both campaigns have spent at least a year really courting that vote, using English and Spanish, talking about the economy, about healthcare. And so I think there is a difference because they have understood reluctantly, to your point, that we care about issues that every single American cares about, right? Not just immigration. And then I think the second point that you make around, what was the second one?
I know I did the thing I should never do, which is a multi-part question. The second
No,
one
but I
was
think it's
around
fascinating. I think it says
the
everything.
the second part was the Staten Island experience of the Mexican migrants versus the recently arrived migrants.
I see it everywhere, right? I think what's interesting is that this election season, suddenly the issue of the border and immigration, suddenly every city and every state has become a border state, right? And I think that's really changed the dynamics. Where like I'm also talking to you from New York City, and like more often than not, immigration is in people's minds. I think, and that's a huge difference that I've noticed this election cycle, where like I think people are really feeling this fundamental threat because I think for the first time they're walking around the city and they're seeing asylum seekers, right? They're seeing migrants, and I think that's really changed the dynamic. I think there's a difference between understanding what that means versus sort of feeling threatened by them. But I think Trumpism and also a lot of Democrats have really sort of tapped into that like ethnic and racial grievance, right? Where I think there's a lot of tension between like the different communities because at the end, everyone's trying to make it. So I also get that.
Yeah, Democratic brand, I think at the local level is a bit muddied. I think especially when it
Mhm.
comes to, you think about immigrant communities generally, right? Like they tend to be more socially conservative. They tend to be, more likely to own small businesses, which means that they might have complicated views on taxation and regulation that Democrats
Mhm.
need to message towards. And I think when it comes to law and order issues, they also might not reflect, I think, where some parts of the progressive base are. And again, like, I don't want to fall into the trap of speaking the other way as a monolith. I think it's complicated, right? But I think complexity is dangerous for Democrats because what Democrats don't want is complexity on this. Like, they want what the
Mhm.
white evangelicals are to the Republicans. They want one voting bloc that's going to consistently vote for Democrats. And if Trump wins this election, maybe one of the reasons why is that this 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 so-called base of Democrats is not a base of Democrats. It has a lot more different subgroups and desires and personalities than we ever gave it credit for.
Yeah, but then what's interesting, I think there's a stereotype around this idea that like Latinos are more morally conservative, and I do think that's right among certain groups. I
It's
think
like the Rio
certainly,
Grande, where I think you spent some time, right?
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think what's interesting in during the midterm elections in 2022, for the first time ever, abortion became a top voting issue for Latinos, right? And I think for years, and I'm victim of this myself, right? For years, the idea was that when you're in front of Spanish speaking Latinas, don't say the word aborto, right? Because the idea is that they would freak out. That's not true. I think what you saw now post Roe v. Wade is that this is a community that is really mobilizing around this issue. I've seen Catholic Latinas do it. I've seen a number of evangelical Latinas do it. I've seen a lot of sort of the abuelas, the grandmas do it. And I think it's because they've been able to humanize this issue, and because it's become this sort of like survival, no, this life and death issue. And I think that's really changed the game. And then I think what's interesting to your point of sort of Democrats not being nuanced, but then suddenly you have a a Kamala Harris that is doing something that I think almost no Democrat has had to do, and that is really become more moderate and even more conservative in their immigration framing, right? I think this is one of the first times that Democrats in a presidential election are not leading with comprehensive immigration reform, and they're actually really leading with sort of this border security, law and order message. And I think that's like a huge shift as well.
And how do you see that playing out? Because you've got this guy in Trump who is promising, like, to do pretty much restrict almost every aspect of immigration. So
Mhm.
people who are here illegally, people who are here legally, people who are here legally but under like a more tenuous status, like the Haitian migrants,
Yeah.
um, like almost every like possible category you could imagine.
Yeah.
Uh, he wants to restrict. And so, but obviously, when you're talking about a federal election, the only people voting in this election are
Mhm.
citizens. And
Yeah.
so the question is, how do they view this mass deportation, right? Like, and has this been effectively messaged? Like, I think about for instance, like broadening it out, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Let's take this gentleman in Lehigh Valley at his word and say, let's treat you like the complex person you are. Forget
Right.
the identity as an immigrant or a child of immigrants. Let's say business owner.
Mhm.
Like, how many people under your employ would be
Exactly.
deported? But I wonder whether people take seriously what Trump is saying on this front. You
I
know?
don't think so. I think you're right. I think the problem is that we've been sort of normalizing this language for so long. We've sort of been saying these words, mass deportation, invasion, immigrants, and I think we've kind of lost sense of what it like actually means on the ground. Like here's what a mass deportation plan actually means. And I think the message is that it honestly is no longer just an immigration issue. It affects everyone, right? There's over 22 million people in this country that live in mixed status families, and that includes over 10 million US citizens. And so we're talking about a potential reality where families in the interior would be separated. And we're talking about the potential reality where farm workers, could be deported, or to your point, like people that are working day and night in these businesses would also be deported. And that would truly like decimate the US economy. And so I don't think we really grounded ourselves in what that could possibly mean. And I think that's the difference, right? I think maybe if you explain immigration through that lens to American voters, they would see it differently. And I can't help but think about how different the immigration message was exactly 4 years ago. Because I think one of the reasons why Joe Biden was actually able to win exactly 4 years ago is precisely because of the way that he was able to sort of distance himself from Donald Trump and remind Americans of the family separations. And I remember those last couple of weeks of the November 2020 election, one of the things that the Biden campaign did really effectively was remind Americans of those the cries at the border of the children and the moms being separated. And I think thinking about voters in Pennsylvania, moms in Ohio, sort of conservative women in Virginia. I think it really worked because they were able to sort of see the similarities between themselves and these sort of migrant mothers. And now look at where we are, right? Where it's like it's a totally different framework and messaging. And the country has shifted to the right on this issue. I mean, that's just a fact as well.
Well, you also had COVID, right? So you had
Yes.
a historic slowdown in immigration. And what followed it? Well, now you have Harris Harris, despite all of her efforts, is still going to be painted as part of an administration that she's vice president in. And there was, obviously record increases in unauthorized immigration into this country, which the right has done a really effective job at
Mhm.
painting for what it is. And so I think like that ground has shifted under Democrats. And so she's got to own that in a way.
Totally.
And I think like they've done probably better in the short term, I think, at neutralizing it, and worse in the long term. I remember I was listening to an interview with Jim Messina, the
Mhm.
sort of strategist of the Democrats, and former Obama campaign manager, was probably campaign manager where you were there when you were
Yeah,
20, if
yeah,
you were
he was.
2012.
Yep.
I was 08, so
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
didn't work with him directly that much. But he said something on Tim Miller's podcast where he said he was in this might have been 9 months to a year ago. He said he was talking to the Biden White House and saying, look, you got to take immigration seriously. You got to show that you're like putting your back into it, whatever series of solutions you want. And was told that whenever we're talking about immigration, we're on Trump's terrain. And it was at some like
Mhm.
ungodly early hour that made me wonder, like, were we in campaign mode? I use we. This is not a Democratic podcast, but we're Democrats in campaign mode for far too long on this issue and not enough in problem solving mode. Like I give them full credit for trying to push the bipartisan immigration deal that Trump killed and all that kind of stuff. But it does make me wonder whether there was too much policy going on for too long on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, my first gut reaction when I saw the vice president at the border doing this sort of policy speech and blaming Donald Trump for not passing the sort of the Senate border bill, my first question was, can you out Trump? Right? Like, is that an effective strategy for Democrats? Like, can you ever be to the right of Trump? Can you ever appear more aggressive than Trump at the border? I think the answer is no. And so I am really curious to see how all of this plays out. I think at the national level, you do see the way that her message may be working now by being more moderate. But then I think of voters in Nevada and in Arizona, right? I think of the fact that like Joe Biden won in Arizona by less than 1% in November 2020. And part of the reason he was able to win was because of the younger Latino voters that sort of grew up watching their parents being criminalized under people like Sheriff Arpaio and sort of being really threatened by racial profiling and the detentions. And so I'm really curious to see how this sort of more moderate approach will work with these Latino voters in Nevada and Arizona, where immigration is really personal, right? It's very personal in a way that it just isn't in a place like Florida or Pennsylvania or like anywhere in the mainland. And so I think that remains to be seen.
Let me throw a theory your way. My theory is that Trump did a lot of damage to himself, both by trying to kill that bill, but more importantly, with the language around the Haitian migrants. I hear this from a lot of swing voters in my life who it was such a blatant lie that I think a lot of people, it neutralized a lot of other things that Trump was
Mhm.
saying about immigration because it was such a clear lie that they were like, well, what
Yeah.
else is he lying about on this issue? But my theory is that sort of maneuvering from Trump did him more damage with non-Latino voters, in part,
Mm.
and I don't fully have the language to express why, but
Yeah.
I'll use my dad by analogy. My dad is a
Yeah.
Trump-supporting Indian immigrant, right?
Mhm.
So different kind of immigrant, but came to this country, small business owner, doctor, you know, who is never gettable, has never voted for a Democrat in his life, but who is never offended by anything anybody says about immigrants, in part because he's lived it so much. It's just not an issue for him. Like he's just got
Right.
the thickest of thick skin when it comes to any
Yeah.
language whatsoever when it comes to this kind of stuff. So my theory is almost like these swing Latino voters, their sensibilities aren't offended by what happened with the Haitian immigrants because it's not surprising to them. And I think this is like part and parcel to Trump's whole shtick is like
Mhm.
they don't trust any politicians. So when they hear Trump talking the way he does, they're like, well, we kind of bake it in. We think that this is how people talk generally, and they kind
Yeah.
of are more about the bottom line.
Yeah.
That's my theory. I don't know.
No, no, I believe that. I mean, I also think it sort of shifts the attention away from them, no, and it sort of places the attention once again at the border and in these other people, no, the otherizing. I think that's why like otherizing is a really effective strategy when you're a black and brown person, right? Because no longer are all of the eyes on you. No, no longer are you a target. No longer are you sort of the target of discrimination. It's someone else. And I think it's a really, really powerful thing. And I do think, I mean, look, I think the the Haitian migrant image of them eating pets, I think that's a strategy that is really effective, right? Because I say this all the time because it sort of infuses like the core of Trumpism, right? Which is anger, resentment, and disgust. And those are really, really powerful tools that work with everyone, right? You can sort of insert ex migrants into that equation or insert trans people or insert any other minority. And that's sort of at the core of Trumpism, right? It is disgust, it's anger and resentment. And that formula is super powerful.
yeah, what's fascinating, the legacy of this election could be that identity groups, whether it's, we'll put white evangelicals to the side because they seem to be the most like durable identity group in this country,
Yeah.
but white suburban voters, white women, black men, Latino men, Latino women, by the way, like I was looking at the polling, is just shifting even more towards Trump than men. The last poll I saw, some of these subgroups that were treated as monoliths are way more complex, and I think there's some short-term pain from that
Mhm.
for, especially if you're Democrats. Although for Republicans, I think with white women, that could be, you could see it going either way, right? Like the explanation
Totally.
of this election, one way or the other, could be that previously taken for granted Group X behaved in a way that you wouldn't have predicted a
Mhm.
few years ago. And maybe that's a good thing for our politics, as if the more voters are up for grabs, like, and each party really had to make a case that was unique and genuine and dynamic to different groups. Like, I'm trying to be optimistic here.
Oh yeah, no, no. I think look, I think it is. I think I specifically think about like younger Latino voters that are actually, and that's what the polls show, they are more liberal and more progressive, the younger folks. But I think what we're seeing is that they are not afraid of challenging the Democratic Party, right? I'm thinking of the folks in Nevada and in Arizona. They're not afraid of challenging, they're not afraid of asking for more, they're not afraid of asking to be courted the right way. And I think that's also part of the sort of force that we're seeing where we may be mischaracterizing them as being more quote independent or sort of, you know, abandoning the Democratic Party. But perhaps is to your point, they're doing something right, which is maybe
Right,
what the older generations of Latinos didn't do, right? Which is
right.
you were told, and that's so interesting because most of these conversations that I've been having for the last years, the legacy has always been, your family votes for Democrats. Like that's what you do. Like I will do what my mom did and my dad did. And so I think now you're seeing people that are questioning that. And to your point, I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I try to put myself in people's shoes, right? If somebody tried to court me as an Indian American voter, I would laugh
Mhm.
at them. It's just not part of my identity in any way.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because I'm half, but
Mhm.
it's just not how I think of myself. It's not how I grew up. It's not, yes, there are parts of me when I see Kamala Harris that I'm like, oh, this is cool that there's a half Indian person running,
Mhm.
but it's like, so it's not even 10th on my list of concerns, right? Because it could easily be Bobby Jindal, or
Mhm.
JD Vance's wife is in. It's like, right. It's like, to me, it's like I have women in my life where like,
Yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene is a woman, like doesn't mean I'm going to vote for her because she's a woman, right? It's like
Right.
the identity doesn't take precedence over other things, right? It's
Yeah.
a subtle, it can be subtle if you feel like somebody
True.
speaks to you. Like for instance, Obama was very attractive to me as a candidate, as a mixed race
Yes.
person who spoke to that as part of his identity in ways that I understood. But
Yeah.
again, like sometimes I cringe when I see the Democratic message on some of this stuff. Like it's too blunt force instrument.
Well, I actually, this is one question where I don't know how I feel about that anymore because I think I do notice like among Latinos, there is this sort of like existential identity crisis going on, right? Where we're sort of wrestling with this idea like, is there such a thing any longer as having like a collective voice, right? Maybe 30, 40 years ago we did, right? Because we were so sort of um our framework was around, being immigrants, right? And that sort of gave us the same values and the same sort of fight. And like it made a lot of sense then. But now I think what a lot of Latinos are wrestling with is this idea of like, what do we have in common? But then also, I think what Trumpism does evoke is another question, which I think people should be thinking about, right? He may be courting you, but how much do you actually belong in Trump's version of America, right? Were he to unleash mass deportations the way that he's promising tomorrow, would you be immune to the racial profiling that would inevitably ensue from that? Would you also be considered one of them the way that he's making us believe? And so I think those are also fair questions to ask.
Well, let me get into my time machine and visit the version of you in 2017 and tell you that Trump today, there was I think it was a YouGov poll today, is ahead with the Arab American vote. A guy who had who tried to institute a Muslim ban and who is, no matter what people listen to this podcast, politics are on Israel Palestine. There's no version of the story in which Trump is to the left of Harris Biden on that issue, and I'm like, this is a world that I would not have predicted. Like,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of painful resentment from a lot of Democrats and progressives. And I think, I mean, I have seen those voters. I've seen former Obama colleagues of mine that feel the same way, that will
yes,
not be
likewise.
voting for her.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of folks in progressive circles that are so sort of resentful and have so much pain that they believe that the morally correct thing to do, and again, regardless of politics, is to punish the Democratic Party, because the thinking goes like that is the only way that would lead to some form of long-term change. But then you have a Donald Trump that said something, whether he means it or not is a different thing, right? But he, a couple of days ago, said something like, I will end the war, right? As simple as that. We don't know if he means it. We don't know what it means, but just those words, no, I will end the war. I think that's what people are aching for. And maybe, maybe that's what it takes, but it's wild that this is where we are.
I would say when I just detach myself from how I feel about the results of this election and how it could go one way or the other, it is certainly the most fascinating election of my lifetime, easily. And the problem is, I'm not talking about a sporting event. Like this is a very consequential moment in American history.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in some ways it helps that I have a C3 podcast because it disciplines me to have a conversation like this where, our audience is not, they don't have any questions about where my allegiances lie, but it kind of disciplines you to just be like, all right, like, let's talk about this like it's some kind of computer program. And this is a really gnarly computer program. It's just way more variables than any other election. I spent all morning, I try to give an update every day on where I think the state of the race is. And the variables are enormous in this election, like absolutely earth-shatteringly enormous.
Do you feel different day by day? Like tomorrow, will you wake up thinking the state of the race looks different then?
I've kind of gone from 55-45 thinking Harris was advantaged a couple weeks ago to probably the other way slightly to Trump, but no more than that. Like I have people in my life who've gone like, oh, Harris is definitely going to win, or now they're despondent. And I think, like, generally speaking, my coach talk to Democrats is October is always tough for Democrats. There's always a swing back. It's really hard to read polls because they're both super imperfect. They're blunt force instruments, and a lot of them are baked in assumptions from prior election cycles, and they're not. We don't know a lot about what that means. And the Trump strategy is resting on untested assumptions, but that's right. You have to take seriously, which is this sporadic voters turning out. We did it in 2008 with Obama. Albeit with a much better ground game, but it absolutely could happen. Trump has shown that he can turn out people like never before. And then when you combine that with Black men, Arab American voters, Latino voters, you look at these groups and say, like, you just pick off a couple percent here and there. Like, that's how you win this election. Yeah.
Yeah, in a way, it kind of reminds me of this moment in 2016, because I've heard so many Democrats right now sort of mocking Trump for being too exhausted, or even some people are saying he's hiding in the basement, right? Or like he's so low energy. And I think this is when people get sort of very complacent, and this is when it gets really dangerous, because I think what Trumpism does really well has nothing to do with Trump anymore, and it has to do with the ideology, right? And the ideology has been working.
It's in the bloodstream now.
For exactly.
Yeah, you look at it with
you don't need him anymore. Exactly.
Vance, for example, like this is almost like the T-1000 or whatever, like in Terminator. This is like a more advanced version
Yeah.
of Trumpism, and yeah, in a weird way, and maybe I'll do this as an explainer later today. Is like what's difference between 2020 and today, and one of them is I would say, or 2016 is even a better comparison. Like you said, I feel less complacency. I feel like a lot of worry. I think the fact that we went through 2016, a lot of people in my life are like,
You're right.
the polls aren't showing what they should. Like
You're right.
maybe if we were up, like, or Democrats were up, I keep saying we, in the way that they were in 2016, you'd get a different kind of energy from Democrats. But I do feel like right now people are freaked out for better or worse. Like sometimes that can be good or bad. I don't know. I try not to feed that energy, but it does feel like things are trending Trump's way. The question is like, where was he starting? That's the question that I don't really have a good answer to, right? Like, how down was he a couple of weeks ago? How much energy does he have to make up? And then the other thing is 2 weeks is still a decent amount of time in an election. So is he peaking at the right time, or is he peaking a little bit too early? I don't fully know.
One of the things that I keep seeing in the sort of conservative Trump circles on Telegram and on Twitter, they keep talking about this upcoming caravan that's making its way to the southern border. And I keep thinking about this idea, like, will that be the sort of quote unquote October surprise?
Yeah.
Yeah. They keep saying that there's at least 2,000 migrants that are making their way through Mexico, and may be by Texas and Arizona in less than 2 weeks. And so once again, I think you see like a Trump campaign that's really trying to reenact that 2016 build the wall moment, right? Like taking this country back to the immigration message, which is exactly what worked for him in 2016. And were that quote unquote October surprise to actually work, I think the image of migrants at the border once again could have an impact.
Here's the thing: whether that caravan actually arrives or not, they will pretend like it did.
Of course,
and that's and the other piece here is, and I know some members of our audience hate when I talk about this, but the leveraging of anecdotes to me is disgusting. Like we have a country of what 300 million people now. Like on any given day, native-born and immigrants are both committing heinous crimes. Like the question is like, speak in terms of statistics, right? And we've gone through this many times on this podcast. Like to me, like there's this idea of like speak this name, like in this debate. I'm like, well, okay. Like if I was ever in a debate with somebody and they're like, they mention X person, like we need to, you're like, how come I haven't heard about X person, right? Young lady killed by an immigrant, yada, yada, yada. And I've had people criticize me on this podcast for not mentioning people by name. I would just be like, I would just look up whatever crime blotter there is that was killed by a native born American in my city down the street from me, probably today.
Right.
And say, do you even know who that person is? Of course not. Because we don't memorize the names of every victim of every crime. Right. Like, and this is what part of the reason is like, and where I give some of my conservative listeners a hard time is like, this was supposed to be the facts don't care about your feelings party. And all I'm hearing are anecdotes and feelings right now. What I want to hear are statistics, right? Like how much more likely are immigrants to commit violent crimes, right? We know they're less likely to commit violent crimes. Now, the question is, well, okay, people who are recently arrived migrants from certain countries. I haven't seen that data broken down. You might know it. I certainly don't, but I certainly haven't heard any of like the critics of the Biden immigration strategy quoting any lucid data on that front. And I would certainly take it seriously if somebody put that at my doorstep, you know?
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah, no, I'm with you. I spend so much of my time sort of going back to those basics, right? You already laid it out, but yeah, there's no data, there's no evidence to suggest that immigrants are more likely to commit crimes than native borns.
I'm certainly open to it. Like, so you're coming from certain countries, right? Like a good example is the Haiti debate, right? Like the idea that somebody coming from a war-torn country brings risks to this country that you need to take seriously is absolutely a valid question to ask. The problem is it wasn't asked properly. People were making shit up about it, right? And the town that was most impacted by it had very strong feelings about how it was helping that town.
Yeah.
So I'm like, to me, that's dispositive. I don't want to shut down the discussion. Like, obviously, the country you come from, whether it's culturally, the vetting process, where we're sending you. Like, these are all important questions that I take very, very seriously.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
problem is, like, when you don't have a good faith player on the other side, it makes it really hard to disentangle the data, you know?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, okay. You've been so generous with your time. Tell us where we could find your book, and all the other work that you do.
No, no, no. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm finally so excited to be doing this with you. So my new book is called Defectors: The Rise of the Latino Far Right. You can find it in any of your local bookstores. And so it's out there. I think, unfortunately or fortunately, it'll help explain some of the shifts that we're seeing in the country. But yeah, it's out, and you can also find me at Paola Ramos.
Well, some amazing vignettes as well, like a candidate, conservative candidate in the Rio Grande Valley, the evangelical movement. I mean, you go through it all and really give stories behind the data and the surge, and take very seriously this new and rising trend. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.